Good morning, and thank you for joining Fueling the Future, Clean Energy and Bioproducts session. My name is Dr. Simran Brar. I'm a Research and Innovation Manager in Natural Resources and Agriculture at Genome BC. This session will discuss bioproducts and innovation derived from renewable biological resources and processes to create a sustainable solution and support a circular economy. I'm joined by 4 panelists who work in very different areas of bioinnovation, from large-scale fabrication of products using forestry and agriculture waste, to biomining, to the use of microbes to produce dyes and microorganisms that produce unique metabolites. We just heard a keynote presentation from Dr. Orlando Rojas, who is joining our panel today. Orlando is a professor and Canada Excellence Research Chair at UBC and the Scientific Director of the Bioproducts Institute. He is joined by Dr. Krishna Mahadevan, Canada Research Chair in Metabolic System Engineering Principal, Investigator, Laboratory for Metabolic System Engineering, and Biozone, Centre for Applied Bioscience and Bioengineering at the University of Toronto. Sarah Graham is also joining our panel today. Sarah is the Chief Innovation Officer and co-founder of LightOne, a Vancouver-based company transforming the polluting colorant industry with microbial-produced dyes, and Jorg Bowman, professor at the Michael Smith Laboratories at the University of British Columbia. Following our session, we will have an interactive Q&A session with you, the audience. You can ask your questions anytime throughout the talk using the Q&A panel on the side of your screen. You can also upvote your questions as they appear, and we'll use the most popular ones during the Q&A session. We're going to start with a brief introduction from each of our panelists. So, if they could please provide a brief background and a description of your work. We will start with Orlando.
Thank you so much, Simran. It's a big pleasure to be here in company also by this stellar group of colleagues. My name is Orlando, and prior to coming to Canada, I was in Finland, where I was active in the area of forest bioproducts. And what I'm trying to advance here in UBC, but for that matter across Canada, is to really look into the Bioproducts Institute as a global leader in bioproducts research and development. Canada is very rich and blessed with natural resources, and the technology that has been developed in Canada is really amazing. But Canada, at the same time, has lost a little bit its momentum from the past. And I think we need to come back to this idea of valorizing the fiber that we have available in across Canada. And here I'm talking in general of fibers, the fiber baskets. That means forest resources, plants, as well as residual materials, including food losses and waste. And I think these are the key components for a low carbon economy or to a transition to defossilization. If we think about climate change, pressure, resource sufficiency, environmental stress that we see, also the ecology of the system and the social unrest and other challenges like those, I think there is not really a quick fix. If we think about the best opportunities, that would be conversion of CO2 into the materials that we need every day. That will take still so very long. So I think we need to look into combination of technologies so that we can really address those emissions that I listed. And in that sense, I think one that is important is the use of the resources, the natural resources, the biotic platform that we have in the country to support social low carbon economy. So in the Bioproducts Institute that I direct as a professor, we try to advance those technologies that can really help in the transition. And here we are mindful that for us in academia, we should be measured, of course, by the scientific products and the publications, but there is really now a big pressure for us to look into translating the knowledge, making an impact, creating opportunities for our students and our talent so that they find investment for innovation and adoption in the bioproducts to diversify the bioeconomy. So in a nutshell, I'm a professor, my training is in chemical engineering, and I'm very mindful about the synergisms that can exist between biology, material science, chemical and biological processes in really activating this transformation where Canada can really play a very important leading role. So that's our mission in BPI, that's the mission in UBC, and our colleagues, of course, share similar visions than mine. Thank you.
Next, Krishna, can you please provide a brief background on your research interests?
Right. Thank you, Simran. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And it's amazing to see the talk and hear from other experts like Orlando. It's fantastic. So in my group here at the University of Toronto, we are actually focused on engineering biology for practical applications in clean energy and bioproducts and that space. And so one of the core technologies that our group works a lot on is to develop computer models of biological systems. And specifically, we look a lot at metabolism, basically how these microbes are able to eat their food and how they're able to respire, and how you can coax these microbes to make certain interesting products from their native food resources, if you will. And so we do that using a couple of different technologies. One is what is called some sort of deterministic type modeling, where we use some physics-based principles, where we just say, equations where things around F equal to ma, those kind of equations that you might learn in a high school physics, is something that we can use in modeling these microbes. Separately, we're also using some new techniques that are derived from database techniques around artificial intelligence and machine learning, specifically using language models to represent the protein sequences, and using these language models, protein language models, to kind of engineer enzymes and microbial pathways so that you can enable the conversion of raw materials into useful products. So that's an area of research that's gone on in our group. And I think this area, of course, is catalyzed by the fact that there's a lot of interesting options in terms of machine learning based structure predictions of enzymes, which can then drive the overall engineering of these biological systems. The main applications for us are in two areas. One is in I would say in biochemicals production. So one of the things we're looking at is things around trying to convert something like a potato starch to nylon precursors that could be used in textile applications. And another application that we have just recently begun is in the sustainable biomining area. So where we are trying to take engineered and native microbes and trying to treat these mine tailings to not only remediate them, but also recover value-added products such as critical minerals and nickel that's used in battery applications. And so with these kind of advances in the ability to engineer biology, we think that there could be a whole slew of practical applications that are now possible. So we are just I think at the tip of the iceberg in terms of these possibilities, and I'm really looking forward to the next few years, which is going to be exciting in terms of the ability to engineer these organisms using all these different tool sets that are available to us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Krishna. Sarah, will you provide some more information on Light One and your journey with the company?
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here. My journey here was very nonlinear. So I grew up a really creative kid, always thinking outside of the box, building something out of nothing. And as a young person choosing my career path, I felt like I didn't fit into that rigid frameworks that were being presented. I was always pulled between the sciences and the art, and these two were always presented as separate and like opposite disciplines I had to choose between. Then fashion design in my mind was this magical field where boundaries could be pushed, metaphysical creativity and imagination could come together with the physicality of design and construction to create things that tell stories of the world around us. In my mind, this was the closest I could get to bringing it all together. But working in this field, I was confronted with the damage that the fashion industry has on the planet and the people that are working within its systems. So much of this is driven by the materials that we're choosing at the design stage. So as I started digging into materials, I realized this was a path that was aligned a lot more with my passion. It could also be this intersection of my interests while also making a change in the world. but I still didn't feel like any of the job descriptions I was seeing resonated with me. So I created my own path, leaving my job as a fashion designer to undertake a master's in material futures at Central St. Martin's in the UK. This is one of the top design schools in the world. And I was encouraged here to look at the world through a disruptive lens and challenge the status quo and speculate on how we might shape the future. I was introduced to the emerging field of biodesign. This field perfectly melds design, science, creativity, and analytics, creating a collaborative relationship between living systems and the design process. And it meshes the sciences and the arts not as opposites, but as really complementary areas. So this kind of perfectly fulfills my drive for perpetual learning and innovation, bringing a huge range of fields into one multidisciplinary context. So I dove headfirst into learning scientific disciplines like microbiology through practice, persuading scientists in the labs across the UK to let me work alongside them on my microbial design projects. I fell in love with bacteria, and I positioned myself as one of the pioneers in this new field of biodesign. I met my co founder, Roya, through my practice, and hearing her very similar journey of discovery, we knew that we had to come together to establish a first of its kind biodesign company in Canada. So we co founded Light One, where every day we collaborate with beautiful and vibrant bacteria to grow the future of color.
That's great, thank you. And finally, Jorg, please provide a little background on some of the areas of research that you are involved in.
Thank you, Simran. It's a real great pleasure to be on this panel with those esteemed colleagues, Orlando, Krishna, and Sarah. In my work at UBC over the last 25 years or so, much of what we've been doing has been in the space of forestry genomics, and very grateful to the continued funding from Genome BC and Genome Canada for this work. Behind the forestry genomics scene, we had a bit of a second life that is exploring plant bioproducts in the space of plant biodiversity. And I guess we have an audience right now, so I just put a question to the audience, and I will guess on the answers. I guess that everybody by this time of the day will have had maybe a coffee or a tea, or may have had a smoothie loaded with berries and antioxidants, or may have had a glass of wine yesterday, or may have brushed their teeth this morning with toothpaste that includes something like menthol. Unfortunately, I know that many of you will have people in your circles who suffer from cancer. And why I'm asking this question? This is because in all of these contexts is where plant-specialized metabolites play a very, very significant role in our society. We drink coffee and tea because they have stimulating activities that are directly related to caffeine. We drink oxyantioxidant smoothies because they contain resveratrol, an antioxidant very prominent in berries, blueberries that Orlando talked about earlier in his keynote. Some very, very potent small molecule anti-cancer drugs are produced in plants. Taxol is a prominent example. Another is vincristine. And this goes back to the issue of plant biodiversity. Behind plant species diversity is a large space of chemical diversity, where each species has its very unique repertoire of chemicals that are not abundant across the entire plant kingdom. But you find caffeine producing plants only in a few groups. You find Taxol only being produced in the yew tree, and so on and so on. And very often these sources are limited to provide the plant metabolites, these very specialized high-value metabolites that we need in large quantities as biomedicals, as fragrances, as food ingredients. So moving from biodiversity to bioproducts to support human health and nutritional food security, for example, what we are doing in our work is we're using genomics approaches to discover how plants produce these high-value metabolites, and then we re-engineer these pathways into production systems that can be grown to scale, yeast or large-scale plant production. And that's what we're doing.
Great, thank you, Jorg. Everybody has such a diverse background in terms of research, but there are some strings that kind of connect all of you in different areas. My first question, I'd like to kind of follow up on the background that you just presented on and your research interests, and ask about the impacts of your work. How is your work or your field contributing to a more sustainable society or ecosystem, and what are the impacts? Maybe Sarah, you can start.
Sure. So at Light One, we're at the forefront of transforming the color industry from one of the most pollutive sectors into a clean and circular one. So we're doing this by growing high performance, sustainable dyes from bacteria in a circular system. This industry currently is driven by petroleum and non-renewable based colors. But there's so many bacteria that produce colorful compounds for their own use, but we can repurpose these colorful molecules into highly sustainable colorants for industries like textiles, cosmetics, food, basically anywhere that you see color. Using dyes from nature is not a new concept, but I think there's something so beautiful about connecting our past with our future and using traditional knowledge and leveraging new technologies to create novel ideas. So we're using the genetic technologies that nature has developed over millions of years, getting inspired by the thousands of years of traditions that humans have had, looking to nature for color and combining it with the cutting edge knowledge and tools of today in biology, genetics, and chemistry to create a truly revolutionary way of producing color that can lead us into the future. So at Light One, from the beginning, we're thinking from the beginning to the end, the impact that we're having on the environment. So from the beginning, we're replacing extractivist practices of mining and drilling for the raw materials that make color with a circular system that draws from feedstocks from industrial waste streams. Then during the use phase, we're replacing the toxic synthetics that we have that have led to biodiversity destruction, poisoning of drinking water, cancers, respiratory illnesses in workers with a safe colorant. The biological waste that we're producing during the manufacturing systems engineered into value-added products and fed back to our processes at various stages to create circularity. And then finally, also at the end of life of whatever object we've colored, that color can biodegrade safely. It could even be composted. So we really think holistically about the impact that we can make with our colors from the beginning to the end.
That's great. Maybe Krishna, you can follow up with that, with some of the microbial
Yeah,
work you're doing.
so I think the core work on the computer technology is that you can accelerate the design of these microbes, right? So now if we can systematically design microbes, then you can almost order designer microbes that does specific tasks. So for example, in the biomining side, right, if we come up with the right cocktail of microbes that's able to treat these mine waste, then that could lead to some significant impact. So for example, not only will you provide some remediation solutions, so the problem of acid mine drainage can be mitigated, but in addition, you'll also get a potential for clean water, and also if you're able to recover the nickel, then these nickel can serve as important resources, critical metals for battery applications in electric vehicles and stuff like that. So we can have like three-headed benefits using the same technology. So this is just one example of what improved microbial and genomics can do in terms of developing new bioprocesses for mining applications.
Great. Maybe Jorg, you can follow up with what microbes can do with unique metabolite production.
Yeah,
The
thank
impacts
you.
of your work.
Yeah, and what they can do for the sustainable production. Actually,
Yes.
this is where I think we link very closely to Sarah's work and to Krishna's work. And as a matter of fact, Krishna and I have been working together in the previous Genome Canada funded project, where Krishna's role was to do a lot of computer-based modeling for the bioengineering of microorganisms to produce high-value plant metabolites. And in the context, so your key question was about sustainability and how this type of work contributes to sustainability. There's two parts to this. So engineering microorganisms to produce high-value plant specialized metabolites sustainably contributes to the supply of such compounds that are rare in nature, that are coming from rare species, or coming from species or can only be grown in regions of the world that may be currently geopolitically unstable. This is where engineering such pathways into a microorganism, growing these microorganisms in a fermentation system, also engineering them into other plants and growing them in vertical farming, can provide a sustainable source for such compounds. And related to this is the second aspect of sustainability, which is in the context of protecting existing biodiversity. Very often, high-value plant-specialized metabolites, be them pharmaceuticals or high-value fragrances or pigments, are being harvested in a non-sustainable way from species in the natural environment. Sandalwood exploitation in India, for example, is an example where trees are being poached in the same way as rhinos are being poached in some parts of the world. It's the same type of non-sustainable poaching of wild species. By producing these compounds in an engineered way in microorganisms where people like Krishna are supporting our work with their modeling, we can actually help protecting the natural biodiversity.
I'm really glad that you did bring in biodiversity and tied it to bioproduct development and the circular economy, because I think it is a component that sometimes doesn't necessarily always fall. You know, we think about how can we use waste products to develop something new, and we don't think about the preserving of the plant, animal, kind of natural resources that we already have. So that was really great, Jorg. And Orlando, some of the impacts of all of the different work that you're involved in.
Yeah, this is great. So this is, of course, thinking about what is that I can contribute as a person. This is, of course, a personal mission that each of us can have. But I have been long enough in my academic career to then realize that at some point in life, you want to create a bigger impact. And that's what motivates me. So my answer is a little bit more holistic in the sense that I have my own research group, but now I think that is important also for people to really commit to the transformation. And that implies not only the work in the lab, in our own groups, but also to integrate. And the key word here is to integrate. And we already heard the multidisciplinarity from our colleagues, how they integrate different areas of work and different disciplines. I really believe on this. Personally, in my research group, all my life, I have worked not only with physicists, material scientists, and wood scientists, but also with designers and artists, because what we have here is a little bit of a lack of communication to connect with the society at large. So looking this into the bigger perspective, really, what I want to do is to try to involve many different components in our society to advance the mission that I lay out at the very beginning. And that means we need connection with industry, with communities, with government to really make a difference. So from that point of view of leadership or what I do as a director of the BPI, beyond my own research, I'm trying to really move the needle in the sector, in the Canadian sector, when we talk about the forests and biological resources. As I said before in my presentation, there is really a major need for the government to have scientific advisors that needs to be involved in the decision making. And I think this is lacking. So we need to put some time in developing such streams of work so that we can really produce something that can be adopted, can generate value for a community, and really with the whole idea of advising this circular bioeconomy that we are talking about. So very important to integrate the different components. So my short answer is I try to integrate to make a difference in this area, leading a group of professors and researchers and trying to create the impact that we all envision. There is need for that. And Canada is a very important component in the global ecosystem that can really be a model. And I think there is a great opportunity for Canadian government, Canadian researchers, and the communities that are all involved in this transformation.
I think that leads nicely into, actually, it's one of the audience questions, and it was actually a question of mine that also came up, Orlando, when you were giving kind of your brief introduction. You had mentioned that Canada is losing maybe a bit of momentum in the bioproduct space. So how can Canada become a leader, and where does it sit globally? And can you kind of comment on how the other countries are doing, or what other countries are kind of leading in the bioproducts development space?
There are many answers that jump to my head to address that question. And of course, there are many components that we can share, to some level. When I compare the Canadian ecosystem with the Swedish ecosystem or the Finnish ecosystem, that is very innovative in the area. If I take Sweden, they have the king and the queen, and the king and the queen of Sweden are present in all the events related, for instance, of I will cite one, the Wallenberg Prize, Marcus Wallenberg Prize in forest bioproducts, right? What I'm trying to say is that we need the involvement of government and society at large, politicians, and for that they need to be educated. In those countries that I just mentioned, if you ask people around about any molecule in a tree or in a plant or cellulose or lignin, people will connect right away. If you talk to politicians, they will connect right away, because in some cases, in some countries, up to 20% of the exports of the country and the economy depend on the plant resource. This is not the case in Canada, that in the past was the case, but now has shifted a little bit. And there is not really that sort of association between the natural resource that is in Canada and the opportunities for business development and to also grow communities. So I would say that that's a basic aspect. Industry is the other one. I wish we had instruments like in the European Union, the Horizon Europe program nowadays, that interfaces industry with universities and research centers to work in collaborative ecosystems to advance given technologies. I think in Canada there is great talent. The different research centers across Canada is really great. The infrastructure is in place. There is also an appetite by the government to advance this bioeconomy. What we need is to, again, integrate those components. That's where I think we are lagging a little bit behind. We have the talent, really, and we have the resource. What we need is a little bit of a conversation to guide the strategy in the area. I mentioned in my talk, we have the EV strategy, critical minerals strategy, but I think we need to add to that strategy. And that's what I'm trying to actually do. Last week, I was visiting the capital for that purpose. We need to add a strategy that relates to plan to the forest resource and how to become, for those resources to become part of the solution of the defossilization that we all envision.
That's a very interesting kind of perspective. And I'd like to ask Sarah how she feels, and how, being in a small company here in Vancouver, how does Canada fit in a global scale, being in a startup?
Yeah, I have a lot of similar ideas to what was just said, but also conflicting perspectives as well. For Light One, we're a color technology company, so we're not a manufacturer. We're not going to build our own factories, but we are currently looking ahead to the next couple of years and asking where we will produce our products once we pass this scale-up phase. So the biomanufacturing capacity in Canada for industrial products is like non-existent. You have to kind of look elsewhere in the globe. So you have a lot of innovative startups happening in this area in Canada. We're leveraging government funding. We're building amazing teams, doing our R&D here, but then we can't move past the pilot stage inside Canada. So we take this innovation out of the country to somewhere where we can access, the facilities, and we're spending capital there, taking the intellectual minds there, making money, paying taxes there. So it's a bit like, how amazing would it be to be able to be a Canadian company making bioproducts in Canada, an industrial biomanufacturing. And this is a relatively new manufacturing field. So I think that there's still a lot of growth that can happen overall in general. There's a little bit of industrial facilities and like pockets around the globe, but there's still time for Canada to become a leader in this. So I think that's somewhere that the infrastructure in Canada could really be pushed.
Yeah. Krishna or Jorg, do either of you have any comments? Or Krishna?
Yeah, maybe. I think it's fantastic to hear these different perspectives, and I think one thing I'd like to add is that when you think about these things as a big funnel, right? So on the entry side, you have lots of discoveries and things like that that can happen either in a lab phase or in another industrial settings, and somehow you have to take these technologies and move it on to the scale, right? So I think Canada has invested in certain key areas and has some strengths in key areas, I would argue, right? The genomics is something that Canada established the genome centers, and there is a lot of projects, including yours and many other projects that came out of those genome funding, right? And there's a lot of discoveries that come through it, of course, and inherently Canada, of course, has strengths in the AI space as well. But I feel like we've lost a little bit in terms of ability to take some of these basic things that come out of these investments that were made and translate them into some useful things that like Sarah is mentioning, right? So I think there's got to be investments at multiple scales that needs to be made, maybe at the discovery stage, but also in the so-called scale-up slash manufacturing space where you're able to go from lab scale to industry scale, and then there is some in between scale there, which at the pilot and the demonstration scale, which I think is completely lacking in Canada. And as Sarah points out, that's something that we have to be very mindful of and see what are other mechanisms we can come up with to mitigate that gap, if you will.
And
And
Jorg,
also,
I had.
sorry.
Yeah, no
I just
worries.
wanted to and or instigate a little more conversation around Orlando when you mentioned that there's like great talent here. Like, I definitely agree with you, but from my experience, like the education system in Canada, especially in the earlier years, for growing the talent, I feel like there's something that can be done there to improve. It's been really interesting to build our incredible team at Light One, and realizing the core team of Light One, I'm the only person who went through the early Canadian education system. I'm so proud that we've been able to attract top talent from around the world and bring them to Vancouver, but it's just been very, very interesting that. And even from my own experience, school felt like you're being trained to kind of like slot directly into an existing job description, the structure that exists right now, which is good for getting a job right out of school, but we can all look around and see that the existing structure is not working. So how can we fuel this change for a more equitable future without pushing young people to think differently and giving them tools and confidence to challenge that current structure, and imagine and then build it back? And again, like, I had that confidence or tools until I studied in London. So I think that there's area to improve there as well. And I'd love to hear more about like what you're seeing actually being in those universities.
Maybe, yeah, Jorg, do you have some comments on that? And maybe from like what you're seeing in the university, or even from...
Yeah, my comment was not directly answering Sarah's question, but still on the previous conversation with Sarah and Krishna about what is missing and where the challenges are. So I can just add a couple of examples to this, very specifically in the area of biomanufacturing and needing to de-risk the enterprises in engineering biology, because I think all along, and this is for decades, Canada has been doing extremely well in the discovery space. And again, I use examples from the plant specialized metabolism, where it was Canadian laboratories that discovered the biosynthesis for pain relieving medicines such as morphine or discovered most of the biosynthesis for the anti-cancer drug vincristine, or made key contribution to discovering the biosynthesis of the anti-malaria drug artemisinin. But in all of these cases, and there are many others of those, the next step towards bioengineering and building startup companies around this, and in some cases being successful and taking them all the way to market, did not happen in Canada. It happened in the US or other jurisdictions. And I think there is a need to overcome this challenge, that we need to de-risk those next steps to really capitalize much more on this very successful discovery space that we have in Canada. And I don't know how this relates to the need for highly qualified professionals that are needed in the industry that Sarah is involved with.
I actually have a follow-up question for you, Jorg. So what about the regulatory environment here in Canada? Like you're working with unique compounds that can be used for medicinal purposes. Do you find that the regulatory kind of framework here is a challenge that may be a little bit easier to navigate in other areas, or how has that impacted any of your work that you're doing?
I'm not an expert on that, so I
Okay.
wouldn't be qualified to do this, but the regulatory context is an important one for medicinally active plant metabolites. If you take, for example, cannabinoids, right? You could say, why would we want to bioengineer cannabinoids? Cannabis
Yes.
produces a lot of them, and we have a cannabis industry that has been supported with genomics initiatives. The key is the regulatory framework around complex plant extracts that contain many different compounds. But medicinal applications require testing on single compounds. And getting single purified compounds from a plant extract is very, very difficult to achieve. But an engineered biological system, such as the yeast cells that one could work with, or bacterial cells, they can be designed to produce one very, very specific compound, one very specific cannabinoid. And that can then be tested for its medicinal properties. So this is where regulatory space comes in.
Okay. Krishna, do you have any insight kind of on the regulatory space and where you are? And this might be also an interesting place to maybe bring in some of the AI work you're doing as well, and how that's impacting any of these challenges.
Yeah, I'll answer this in order. So on the regulatory space, right, I have a colleague who is more well versed in this space, and in my discussions, I think there is a general understanding that Canada is a little bit more stricter, if you will, in terms of the regulations compared to at least the US. But there are some framework that is defined, and we can operate within that framework and make sure that anything that we come up with in terms of bioprocesses provides or meets those regulatory frameworks. So I wouldn't cast this as a major barrier. It's just like any other scale up process, right? It's a step that you have to go through. So that's something that I just want to put it out there in terms of the regulatory piece. In terms of the AI and the machine learning piece, I think that this is something that we are on the cusp of something really amazing in terms of our ability to use these AI tools and power engineering biology. So, for example, yesterday there was a paper that came out around talking about this AlphaFold, where folks that have used machine learning to predict protein structure has now expanded the scope of it to be able to predict not just the protein structures, but its ability to interact with a whole range of ligands. So now you can start to look at how these proteins are interacting with new sets of molecules, and now the whole world opens up in terms of being able to design, right? Of course, there are also challenges around the AI space, and one of these challenges is the getting the right type of data sets that you can train these AI based models, right? So, and I think the in certain environments where data is limiting, then the ability to use these AI and ML applications is going to be limited by the amount of data that's coming in. In a sense, it's the quality of the data goes in is equal to the quality of the predictions out. So that's one part. The other piece also on the AI side is on the compute side, right? There is, of course, there's going to be have need for a compute infrastructure, and these days it's super difficult to get your hands on these advanced GPUs that are required for training some of these large-scale models, right? And that along with the data, that is the genomic data that needs to be stored, and the data that comes when the genomic data is processed, all of this also points to a compute infrastructure that we need to kind of upgrade so that we can meet these challenges, right?
So we have just under 5 minutes. Oh, sorry, Orlando, yes, go ahead.
No, to add the other part of the question, right? I mean, so far we have centered pretty much around proteomics, glycomics. These are very important. In our area, we're talking a lot about glycans and glycomics. And opening up those structures, I'm talking about cellulosic-based heteropolysaccharides that are so abundant in nature, is very critical in the future, right? So when we talk about commodity products, they are, to a large extent, many of them at least, a structure or base on glycan, on sugar-like molecules, right, that are in the form of polymers. In that area, I think there is a lot to be said where we can integrate biomanufacturing, artificial intelligence, and all these tools. But if we think in one area, textiles or packaging materials, here regulation is critical because no change will happen unless there is a framework that allows for companies to really pay attention to the pressures that exist and to change the mindset. And we see that in the area of textiles again and packaging material, where there is really a great opportunity to invest and to do research so that we have a completely change of how we think about material use. So I just wanted to say, in that case, regulation is very critical and is something that, of course, is happening in all jurisdictions around the world.
No, that's a really interesting point. So around like the textile space, and I know this is this probably is more of a question for Orlando and Sarah. What's the pull there? Like, Orlando, in your keynote, you're talking about the use of blueberry waste in creating fibers, and that can be used in the textile industry, and knowing that they're such a large contributor to carbon emissions. And what is the driver for looking for sustainable solutions? Is it, government giving incentives for greener solutions? Is it consumers wanting different solutions, more sustainable solutions? Is it the designers or the brands that are kind of reaching out? And is this kind of on a global scale, or are you seeing this something in Canada or North America?
My perspective, in a very short answer, is that of course regulation is there as an important component, but many fast fashion companies realize that they are the culprits about the microplastics, nanoplastics, and social and society perception is becoming very negative. So they need to change. And many of those large companies, we can think about many, they have set their own goals by 2030, for instance, to having all the textiles that are produced from recycled streams, right? However, that doesn't solve fully the problem, because still there are many operations that release these micro nanoplastics. And then we need the combination of circularity, so recycling materials, and materials that are biodegradable and don't harm the environment. But in a nutshell, this is coming, and it's coming from social pressure and also from the regulation that we talked about before. And companies really have set their eye on making this transition.
Sarah, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think all three, but like fashion loves to think it's the cutting edge, but they are so stuck in traditional ways and don't want to change things that they're already making money at. So it definitely has to come from pressures of society and consumers, but also from the regulations. I've worked in many of these companies, and I know that they'll accept the bare minimum and use it for marketing. And so that if a consumer doesn't have that full understanding of what it means, and you're saying this is sustainable, they are thinking they're doing the right thing, right? So it's up to regulation and the rules that are actually checking. Nobody's going to check except the sort of government regulation side. So I think it's super important that that comes from there as well. But it's definitely pressure from both the consumers wanting to buy sustainably and the governments really putting their foot down and banning importation, exportation, manufacturing of these toxic and unsustainable materials and products.
We're going to move into our Q&A session, but I have one hopefully quick question before we move on. And I just want to remind the audience that you can still ask your questions using the Slido panel on the side of your screen. I just want to bring the conversation back to Genome BC and how can Genome BC support bioinnovation in BC and maybe this transition from lab to product. And this is, again, out to the whole panel. And Orlando, I see you're shaking your head, so I'll ask you to go first.
No, I was nodding. All the answers that I have here are super relevant, and I agree with all of them. The transition, our little share in the Bioproducts Institute is that we have a program called ATR, Advancing Technology Readiness, that was commented earlier. And this is a way that university can contribute to that mission. It's really putting together the different talent that we have available so that we can account not only for material development, but to look in the issues of environmental impact, social impact. These are so critical for the reasons that we have explained before. So that's a little our little share in the business, right? The second thing that I wanted to say is so important that we integrate, at least in the British Columbia context, or for that matter, the larger Canadian context, with the different organizations and ministries that exist, that are active. One that is close to us is the Ministry of Forest. And here I see a huge opportunity to involve the local communities, the different nations that exist in Canada, because a great opportunity for creating value from local resources that can be produced or can be transformed in a sustainable manner to, again, produce business opportunities. So the social component, maybe we haven't talked too much about it, but it's so relevant also to make the change, right? And that should involve indigenous communities. We see some developments locally in BC, for instance, in this area. Yesterday I was meeting with the indigenous bioeconomy analyst of the Ministry of Forest, and I was very impressed with what I hear. They are promoting by involving the indigenous communities that are present in BC, from flavor and bioactives that Jörg talks, that are added to food, and to many other really great opportunities. And this just requires for people to have a conversation, to talk, and to learn from each other.
Great. Jörg, do you have any comments on how Genome BC can support some of the work you're doing and the bioeconomy in general?
I echo everything that Orlando has been saying. In general, I've been appreciating that Genome BC as a supporting organization has very successfully evolved in the genomic space and has continued to expand its definition of what omics is. And I think that's been extremely helpful and will continue to be very helpful to support us overcoming our various different challenges. The genomics is not just genome sequencing as it was perhaps 30 years ago. So continuing to expand the multidisciplinarity that is required for all of this type of work in the bioengineering space, in bioproduct space.
Great. Sarah, is there something we can do to support, small companies and small businesses?
The funding aspect is very important for research in smaller companies, because it's very hard to raise capital when you are talking about these very deep tech where there's a lot of research before you're going to have any revenue. So supporting through funding is incredibly important. So I'm happy that Genome BC has some open calls right now that we've applied to for funding. But yeah, and then just echoing what Orlando and Björk have already said.
Great. And Krishna, I know you've worked on some of the Genome BC and Genome Canada projects with Jörg, and hopefully will continue to in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are multiple ways in which this could happen. I think one thing is about bringing people together in terms of industries and startups. And for example, bringing on a person like Sarah and putting her on a panel is fantastic, right? Because now she gets some sort of connection to people who actually maybe can help them out in terms of their research. So I think that's a role that Genome BC has I guess, played and hopefully will continue to play. And the other aspects are also around supporting with the funding and investing in the sector, and also helping with training people in the space, right? And I think there is also another space that I think historically all the genome centers have done very well. And lastly, and the other key component would be to try and create awareness. I guess it's important that, like the power and value of these technologies is something that is communicated broadly, right? So that's something that I feel these genome centers can play an important role.
Great. This has been such a great conversation, and we have just under 10 minutes, so we're going to move on to the Q&A portion here. And our first question is, what should be done in the short, medium, and long term in BC to successfully transition to a new sustainable and circular economy? Is there a panelist that would like to go first?
I don't mind speaking first on this.
Sure.
So I think I touched a little bit on it, is like infrastructure for sure. But I also think that what we've talked about today about like bringing multidisciplinary sectors together is super important, because all of the sustainable innovation is amazing. And if you take biomanufacturing as an example, it could be viewed as like a kind of quick fix or direct replacement for today's pollutive manufacturing without a holistic understanding of overconsumption, or really how all these different areas can affect it. For example, with biomanufacturing feedstocks, those are like a really complicated area that could have a large impact on the sustainability. So using land that could grow food or increasing biodiversity for production feedstocks to feed the bacteria then creates a different kind of impact. We also recently learned about how using waste engineered from feedstocks that would otherwise go to feeding animals or other uses has an effect on the sustainability, because then more feedstocks need to be produced. Also, taking organic matter out of soils to feed to these bacteria without replacing that nutrients back in can deplete those soils. So it's like a really wide, complicated, nuanced area in all these different areas that really needs circularity and holistic views, and that takes a bunch of people's expertise to come in on a problem together. So yeah, I think building that community where all kind of areas are talked about and included, and different perspectives are brought in, and different expertise is very important to making like real sustainable change.
Any input on that?
Can I add a little comment?
Orlando.
I think a very important starting point is to have a pan-Canadian strategy for everybody to sit around the table and to agree what is that we need. That's lacking today. As I said, maybe in the other talk, there is an EV strategy, critical minerals, but in this area, we are a little bit lacking or lagging behind. I'm talking mainly about forest and plant-based bioproducts. That really needs to be incentivized. So delineating a strategy with industry, government, really will make a change in the regulatory landscape, and also in funding opportunities and making the right decisions to advance, what Canada can achieve if things better about bioproduct development. So, but having a strategy where everybody sits together, that is lacking. And I think that's important in our area.
Okay, yeah, I agree.
I really agree with that. Sometimes it feels like even provincially we're competing, where it's like a Canada-wide thing. So yeah, I totally.
Jorg, did you have any ideas?
Well, I can't add too much to what Sarah and Orlando already said, but I think that really the pull from consumers will continue to be a very, very large factor for moving forward in the short, mid, and long term. Talking about the textile examples that we heard about, the awareness that much of the clothing that we wear, the ecological impact that production and waste has, and that there's a global inequity to it, and we are sort of like in the privileged space of that global inequity where we consume these products and throw them out again. and that so much that is part of our privileged lifestyle. Think about athletic clothing is a huge burden on the environment, both at the production side and at the waste side. And I think the more consumer awareness there is, in particular in an environment such as Vancouver and broadly more in British Columbia, I think has a large potential to accelerate these processes, so that the technologies that Orlando is developing and that Sarah is expanding on with her business will actually see an impact.
I'm going to move on to another audience question, which I think, Krishna, this is something that kind of falls into your wheelhouse. So Canada is great at developing technology, but then is often sold elsewhere to prioritize. Are there incentives for sustainable tech to stay in Canada?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And this is something that I think all the other panelists, Jorg and Sarah and Orlando, have also referred to. And I think the if there was a chance to grow the institution here itself and have access to a good, strong talent pool along with the additional resources, I see no reason why we cannot hold on to these companies, right? I think this is something that I firmly believe. I think maybe I'm an optimist, but I think I'd like to think that we can create the right environment, right, the incentives and infrastructure that allows them to stay in Canada, and that starts with looking at the entire picture, right, in terms of the making sure that all components, including the talent, the funding, the I guess other types of incentives, consumer and other types of sustainable incentives that promote sustainable behavior is something that is critical, I would say. Right? So, yeah.
Great. And I have one actually final question. It's for Sarah. What needs to happen in order for Light One to be used at the industrial scale level, and how can those of us who want to benefit from a better future help?
So we really need to scale. That's one of our main focuses right now, is being able to take what we have and what's working in the lab or at a small pilot stage and really put that into the infrastructure of the manufacturing systems right now to get those into the hands of consumers. So I think we need that pull from consumers and understanding that bacteria are amazing and they aren't only agents of disease, and that there's so many cool innovations happening in the biomaterial space, and asking for that is really important. And then supporting young companies in moving from scale into that industrial infrastructure is very important. And yeah, that's that's it, I think.
No, that's great. I think we're coming to an end here. There's one more question, and it's for Sarah. Sarah, how can we invite more Indigenous voices to this conversation?
Oh, amazing. I don't know how I'm an expert on that, but I think it's incredibly important to look to those communities and involve, not as just learning and taking from different cultures, but actually listening and integrating and supporting them. So there's this incredible book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's a Potawatomi author and biologist, and she talks about reciprocity. And that's how I sort of look at a lot of the work that I do working with bacteria, but also that talks about humans and our relationships to each other, and not only taking but also giving and supporting and highlighting others' voices. So I think for me, that's how I could do that, is highlighting others' voices. And but yes, I'm not like an expert in that area. But
no, I think that's great. Orlando.
Sarah, one point that I learned actually yesterday, that was an eye-opener for me. Many of the First Nation communities have economic development managers that can be the contact with us in universities, startups, Genome, VC, and others to establish that connection. So yesterday I met with David McCormick. He comes from the ushering nation. Sorry if I mispronounce, but I think that's a good entryway to really learn what is that, what are the needs, what are the opportunities, and I was fascinated to learn the things that are happening in many communities that are developing bioproducts locally for an economic value and to really help the social landscape of those communities. So I was very impressed with the talent that exists. And again, to me, that was an interesting experience talking to the economic development managers of different communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like there's so much knowledge in those communities, traditional long-term knowledge, especially of how we interact with nature and what nature has to offer. And a lot of times that's exploited by, going, learning, taking that, and then putting into pharma, for example. So really involving instead of taking is, I think, very important.
And on that, this hour has flown by, but thank you very much. We are going to be closing this session. So this has been such a thoughtful conversation and an interesting discussion around bioinnovation and bioproducts to support a circular economy. I would really like to thank all of our panelists for all of your insights and background in your work. I think this was a great conversation. We hope the audience has enjoyed our conversation as much as I have. Our next session, Preserving Our Planet, Genomic Engineering for Species Conservation, will be starting at 11:30. And you can access the session by returning to the event hub and clicking on the next session. Thank you.